It's really easy to say that we care about the health and well-being of young people. And I think that there are a few people who would argue that's important, right? Where in education, we want high quality outcomes, academic outcomes, whole person outcomes for our young people. But are we setting up the environment and the culture and the infrastructure, including policies and practices, that really make this a priority?
All right, welcome everyone today to the Education Vanguard show. I'm very lucky this morning here in Hong Kong to be joined by three wonderful guests who I'll introduce in a second and they can do a fuller introduction themselves. First up is a familiar face to the international school community in Asia Pacific, Amy Lawrence Smith, who is a consultant, school-wide health coordinator at Hong Kong International School. She's in an unusual situation at the moment, holed up in a hotel because her elevator's broken in her home and we're inundated with rain in Hong Kong. So a big thanks to Amy for joining under difficult circumstances. We're also joined on the other side of the world by Sarah Bennis, who is Associate Professor and Coordinator of Health Education at Southern Connecticut State University. And finally, Holly, who is joining from New Hampshire. She is the Associate Clinical Professor and Program Coordinator at the Health and Physical Education Program at University of New Hampshire. So we've got some wonderful guests today to talk around health and wellness in education, and specifically in international schools. And because we've got a room full of experts here, I'm going to kick off the questions. Amy will do a little bit of an answer, and then we'll pass off to our experts from the US. So first up, I want to ask, what are, just taking a big picture look, what are the key components of a successful holistic health program in a K-12 school setting? And how can schools balance out all of the things that they need to do, whether that's physical education, mental health, social health education? Feels like there's a lot on schools' plates these days. How do they think through this big problem?
Yeah, this is a great question because it's one that a lot of schools are grappling with right now. As international schools, we don't really have a mandate necessarily about what we need to include in our health programs. So we need to look at best practice and what's happening around the world. And so I'm going to defer to Sarah and Holly on this question because they do a lot of work with states actually in helping develop their standards and their frameworks for their health and PE programs. And for example, they just did the state of Massachusetts new framework, which is amazing. If you're a PE and health combined school, I especially recommend checking that out. But so maybe, Sarah, you can take this one and tell us, what do you think are the key components of a comprehensive health program?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's definitely a real challenge to figure out how to do it all, and especially with the time frame that we have. So I think that the first thing that really came to my mind is the importance of planning from a curriculum and scope and sequence perspective, and really thinking about looking at all the places where health education can happen, like what grade levels it's happening at, and how to make sure that across all of those grade spans, you are covering all these key elements, right? Because we can't do it all in one shot. And the other thing that kind of comes to mind too is thinking about the idea of depth versus breadth, right? And so that scope and sequence planning is going to be so important in being able to ensure that you are able to balance the different components. The other thing that comes to mind too is thinking about where are other things happening, right? So physical health education is often happening in phys ed, right? And maybe there's mental health happening with, guidance or mental health, supports that are happening in schools. So thinking about both like being really intentional with the scope and sequence planning and like what's happening when, but also what's happening where, and how to have really coordinated approaches throughout your schools to ensure that everybody knows what's going on, so that you can have those sort of balances around, like, if we know what's happening here, it doesn't have to happen in health education, and we can focus on what's not being addressed in other areas. And Holly, I don't know what you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think in addition to what you said, Sarah, one of the big things is making it a priority. It's easy to say that we care about the health and well-being of young people. And I think that there are a few people who would argue that's important, right? Where in education, we want high quality outcomes, academic outcomes, whole person outcomes for our young people. But are we setting up the environment and the culture and the infrastructure, including policies and practices, that really make this a priority? And so, whether it is having some policy, and even more than procedures, right? This is where written policy can become really important, because practices and procedures can kind of come and go with changes in administration or other leadership. But written policies tend to have a little bit more of a stronghold about how much time students are spending in direct educational instruction and what other things are happening outside of direct educational instruction. So not everything, as Sarah had said, needs to necessarily be, say, in a health education space, but who is doing it and how do we know that A, all students are getting an opportunity to really receive that direct instruction, but B, are also receiving instruction that helps them to be able to transfer that outside of that learning space. And so we can set up the structures from a even services perspective, but we really also need to be really intentional about having educational experiences that are relevant and meaningful for students.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, Holly, because a lot of the work that we've been doing here at HKIS is kind of putting back in a health program. Because what happens in international schools is, like you said, there's change of admin or teachers and it kind of disappears. And the assumptions are made of, oh, yeah, we do that there. Yeah, check, check, check. Like we kind of tick the boxes. We've covered things, but that direct instruction is really missing.
Right.
And so we've been working hard to make sure that it is policy, that health cannot disappear again. So we've gone from having one health teacher to having 3 now. And it was part of the strategic plan. We had to make very strategic choices around that. And then the final step on that was next year's graduating class will have a 0.5 health graduation requirement for their transcript. And so that is the piece of policy that makes sure that that is locked in and not going to go away. And so in international schools, that's so important. Like you said, we can't cover it all the time, but there needs to be time where they're getting the direct instruction. And then those other spaces like advisory, they're getting a chance to practice those skills in real time. But we want to make sure it doesn't just disappear and we're not just ticking the boxes.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great. And I really like how, Sarah, you talked about the curriculum piece and then Holly sort of like zoomed out to the policy, because I agree, it doesn't happen unless it's policy, both in terms of it's got to be in the program, as you're saying, Amy, but also because health and wellness is more than just the curriculum, right? It's all of the things that are a part of what makes up school, right? Whether that's, I know you've been doing a lot of great work on that, Amy, at HKIS in terms of the whole school or wellness. But just to kind of continue on the curriculum theme, as you're planning out that kind of direct instruction piece, as you were saying, Amy, how can schools pull together all those different components to ensure that they're, scaffolding it and then ensuring that there's not too much repetition across the different grade levels or year levels in the school?
A lot of the work I do consulting is we start with that, with a gap analysis of, okay, where we get everybody in the room of where the school is addressing these things and where the kids are having an opportunity to learn about that. So advisory counseling, your SEL coordinators, classroom teachers in primary school, PE teachers, things like that. And then we figure out, okay, what's happening where are there some holes? And then where are we seeing some overlap? One of the things that I hear from students all over the world when I go consult, I always try to meet with a group of 11th and 12th graders to ask them, what would you like to have had more of in your health program? What would you like to have had less of? In health and advisory, anywhere you learn about well-being. And also, what are some of the big health and well-being concerns in this community? The one thing that I hear across the board that they want less of is repetition. They see a lot of the same stuff if we don't have a coordinated approach and we're not pulling these people together. As one 11th grader in Madrid told me last year, she goes, consent is really important. We need to learn it. I want to make sure we're all learning about it. But if I see that T video one more time, I'm going to lose it. The kids were just being shown that consent and T video every year in advisory. And again, check of the box. So first things first is to do that gap analysis and then figure out, okay, where do we need the direct instruction? Where does it make sense developmentally? Where do we have the resources, both human and time, to make sure we can do that? And where can we add more? And so maybe, Holly, you can add to that because I know you work with districts and bigger kind of organizations around that as opposed to individual schools.
Yeah, and I think to build off of that, oftentimes what ends up happening is that we forget that working in a school can actually really be isolating. If you're a teacher, right, you're in your classroom or you're with your students, so you're with young people all day, but you're not necessarily interacting with the other professionals in the building and what they're doing. And whether that's other classroom teachers or folks in counseling or even in health services. And so we're not having those conversations. And so two things can happen is one, we can be really focused in on what it is we're trying to teach and what we want to accomplish and have really, really good intentions in doing that. However, we don't necessarily whether it's a capacity or a time, there's lots of reasons why it doesn't happen. If we're not coordinating with other people, we have other really well-intentioned and well-meaning people. And to your point, Amy, right? Everybody finds that certain video or they find this new initiative that's happening. And then students are like, wait a second, why are we doing this again? Or even if we are collaborating within our grade span, kind of lower school or upper school, or at those middle grades, we're not necessarily going cross grades. And so, one of the big things that we find that's really important is that, yes, you want to have conversations within the folks in your grade span and whatever school that you're in, but then you also have to make those conversations look across the board. And so doing some of that alignment and really bringing in different folks who are doing similar kinds of work. And I believe that it all starts with setting the stage about what your priorities are as a community. And in this case, it could be your school community, right? And so who are we? What is our portrait of a graduate or our definition of our learners? And really taking some time to not only ensure that we're all solid on what that is, but then everything we're doing is feeding into that and then building out from there. Sarah, did you have other thoughts?
Yeah, I think you covered it all. I think what comes to mind, particularly for this one that you both have mentioned, I think in different ways, is just the need for collaborative time to really come together and think and talk about what's happening and where it's happening. And even like Holly and I have been having conversations this week. We've been running some professional development around things as simple, but also really important as, what skill cues are you using to build a skill? And if they're using one skill in counseling, your skill cues in counseling, and we're not using that same one in health education, that's a missed opportunity, not for repetition, but for building and transfer, right? And so I think that collaborative time and really dedicating time to being able to work together is really critical. And I know I already mentioned this, but I just have to give like a shout out again as a curriculum nerd to this importance of that scope and sequencing, right? Because we can all come together and we can talk about what's happening when, but if we don't document it, right, and we don't have that kind of clear map of what's happening where, oftentimes that's when the repetition starts to happen, right? Because we haven't really mapped it out and been clear on what our focus is and where.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. Part of that gap analysis work is saying, okay, now that we see where things are happening, where is it just implicitly being covered or talked about, and where is it being explicitly taught and assessed? The kids are getting a chance to demonstrate their learning. I see often when international schools in particular try to maybe outsource, especially substance abuse prevention or even sex ed, that there's no actual check for understanding. An expert comes in, it's kind of a content dump, and we haven't really followed up with the kids at all. So that scope and sequence becomes so essential. And actually this kind of feeds into a really important point about international schools that I'd love to get your thoughts on. There's a lot of turnover often with faculty. And so you might have an amazing new counselor comes in who's really skilled and a trainer maybe in a particular type of SEL. And so they come in and they want to bring this program to the school, which is awesome. However, they're not realizing like so many of the standards from health are SEL skills, right? And so we might already be doing that. And there's an opportunity, like you said, Sarah, for us to kind of scaffold. One of the things that can also happen too, we're very well resourced. And so we have new initiatives all the time with international schools, but those initiatives might not speak to each other. So you might have the MTSS and the tier one and things like that when we're looking at multi-tiered supports for students, and SEL is one of those, and they might skip completely what's happening in health without realizing how much of that we're doing. And so having all those people at the table is extremely important.
We can't underestimate that each of the different fields, whether we're talking about health education, we're talking about counseling, we're talking about school services and nursing, or right, those kinds, or even education leadership, everybody has their frameworks, right? Whatever that framework is about what will support young people's health and well-being. And they all go at it from a slightly different approach, though there is a lot of commonality. But as a school, it's really important to come together and say, what are our guiding documents? What are the resources that we are saying this is what we follow? And Amy, I know you've done a lot of work with different materials from the WHO and from UNESCO and right, different things like that. And it can look different. And I think that's the beauty of all of this, is that there isn't necessarily a one size fits all approach. There just needs to be the communication to ensure that each of the parties who are invested in making this happen both know the role and are all heading in the same direction.
Absolutely.
That's great, Holly, and it's a great jumping off point for me because what you're talking about there is context, right? Every school has its own context, every country has its own context. So one of the things obviously that comes into contextual view a lot when it comes to health and wellness is culture. And international schools exist in a variety of different cultures. So I wonder, how can schools take that into account when they're planning their curriculum, the different cultural contexts that they're in?
I think Sarah might be a great person to answer this one. The thing that as international schools assume a lot of times is, oh, we're international, so this framework from the US or from wherever doesn't apply to us because we're so culturally diverse. But then you look at cities like Boston or New York City, and that's a pretty culturally and socioeconomically diverse city as well, linguistically diverse. And I know that you've done a lot of work with culture in particular and the influence of that. So maybe you can speak to this one.
Yeah, so I immediately thought of one of the things that Holly and I have recently worked on is a little bit of like revision of how we think about how health education fits within this broader context. And so I know you were on audio, but like I always think of the bubble. There's like a bubble, right? That we have to really be thoughtful about when we're thinking about health education. And that bubble is both the socio-ecological and sociocultural perspectives that are impacting your school and community. And so what we do now when we're training with teachers is we always start with that. Who are your students? What's in your community? What are the norms? What are the things that are shaping the environments that your students are, because we're all trying to engage and support our health and well-being in our different contexts. And that is like the most critical thing that we can understand. And so I think, international schools are a beautiful opportunity to explore how those different perspectives shape our understandings, right? Because students are coming in with all their different experiences and their different identities and their different cultures, and then they're in a space together, which has its own sense of culture and identity and environment. And so I think it's actually, you can probably just tell I get really excited thinking about this, that it's, to me, that's like the most exciting thing, is to really be able to investigate and be curious about like, what is this particular context and how do we make sure that we bring in that context into our health education classrooms, right? So students need to be seen, right? They need to see other people and other perspectives. They need to be able to make connections to their community, their identity, their culture. So I think it's a really wonderful opportunity to understand that perspective and that context is huge, and it completely changes how we navigate our health and well-being landscape. So yeah, I think we start by leading with that and really investigating and always asking, who are your students? What do they need? What are their interests? What's gonna be relevant and meaningful for them? And then everything stems from there. But that's the first question that we always ask people to investigate when we're working in districts or other settings, is like, who are your people? Who are their families? Who are their communities? And then you work from there.
That's one of the reasons why I meet with students first when I go on a school visit.
Yeah, no,
Yep.
absolutely.
Holly.
Well, and I think too that building off of both of those points is that, not as an educator, that can sometimes feel really daunting, of I need to know all the things about every single one of my students and all their cultural values and beliefs and all of the systems and all of the things. And the reality is we can't. And yes, we do want to understand the context. We do want to understand the community. We do want to get to know our students as best as we possibly can, because we do know that relationships matter. And the way that we kind of work through recognizing that everyone is going to navigate through the space in the way that works best for them is to provide opportunities for students to make it their own. So I can design lessons. I don't have to say your culture believes this, therefore. It is, here's the idea or concept or system that we're talking about here. What does that mean for you? How do you internalize this? How does this show up in your world? How do you navigate through situations such as this? What would be important to you to keep in mind? Or what is the collective environment around you that's really important to keep in mind as you're navigating this health-related situation, about any of the health topics that there could be. Oftentimes we talk about sex education as being fraught with emotion, and people have a lot of deep-seated values and beliefs around it. However, other topics are just as deep-rooted. If we start thinking about food choices and nutrition and substance use, all of those mental health and stigmas related to those kinds of things. So I think that sometimes we get caught up in the sex education space and I don't want to say take for granted exactly, but don't always consider the ways that culture can impact so many aspects of health and well-being, even to the point of caretaking for others versus caretaking for oneself? And do we have the structures in place, or do I believe it's more important to ensure that other people are well taken care of at my own expense? Right. And so having some of those conversations. So really creating those environments that allow students to dig in and be a part of that learning and making it true to them in ways that are meaningful.
Yeah, and that segues great into us talking about skills-based health. But first, I just want to, with the culture piece, one other thing that I think international schools often forget about when designing their program is the context of your host country. You know, teachers come from a variety of backgrounds. I'm from California. I might have a colleague from Texas where there's very different ideas about sexual education in particular, but health education. And we might be teaching at a school in the Middle East where there's some parameters about what we can and can't teach. What we need to figure out, in addition to who we're teaching, is what are kind of the red lines in our host country? And then the flip side of that too is what are the resources available to us? I think a lot of people don't understand the work that the World Health Organization and UNESCO has been doing with health promoting schools. There's global standards around curriculum that countries have taken to update their health curriculum standards. So Thailand, for example, has new health standards, and the sex ed standards are actually quite good. And people kind of forego that and just say, oh, I'm from New Zealand, we'll do these. It's like, oh, actually, let's take a look first at what the mandates are in our host country. What are we allowed to teach? What are we mandated to teach? That also helps parents feel at ease and admin too. And then we can utilize the resources available to us and stay within those guideposts. And then, like you said, Holly, using a skills-based approach is going to help the kids personalize what messages they need and the skills can transfer.
Yes, and the students need to do the same thing, right? Because they're also in a host country where they also need to be able to understand what the implications are in terms of like all the things, right? Consent, what do you have access to for your medical records? What resources are available? So I just had to point out that I feel like everything you just said for the educators is also really true for the students, right? And their families who are there.
It's huge. A huge part of substance abuse prevention right now in international schools is what are the laws in the places you live and travel. My students are here in Hong Kong where there's pretty strict zero tolerance drug policies. Then they travel to Thailand where it's recreationally legal to buy marijuana and not heavily regulated. Yeah. So we need to teach them, what to be aware of when they travel and they move to different places. And so it's such a huge part of that. And that, again, goes back to the idea of skills-based health. And I'd love for you guys to explain in the wonderful way you do what skills-based health is. The way I met Sarah and Holly was going to a SHAPE America National Convention over a decade ago, being my little international teacher self and kind of in my own bubble, and then sitting in one of the workshops with Sarah where she explained skills-based health and feeling like a light bulb just went off. Like, yes, this is what we've been doing. This is what we have to do. They've written the books on it. So please explain to us what skills-based health is and why it's so essential.
Now, at its core and in its nutshell, skills-based health really is about creating an opportunity for students to learn the skills that help them to be agents of their own health and well-being, to increase their capacity as humans to be healthy and well. And we're very, very intentional about making sure that we don't focus on things like just risk reduction, because what we really want to do is help young people and all people ultimately learn and grow and thrive in their own health and well-being. And we do that by focusing on the skills that people need to help them to get there, and then giving them opportunities to practice those, to internalize those, which ultimately will help them to develop the self-efficacy, not only their belief in their ability to do something, and also the agency to do it, that they are the owners of their health and that they are navigating their own ship. And if you've heard Sarah and I before, back in the very beginning, we used to talk about empowerment and the role of empowerment and self-efficacy. And we've really shifted that to being about self-efficacy, which we know has a direct connection to behavior change, and agency. And the reason for that shift is that I, as a human, don't have the power to empower, to either give power or take power away from another human when it comes to their health and well-being. My role as an educator is to support their ability and help them to develop the tools to be able to be again, those agents in their own health and well-being. And so that really all then ties into things, as Sarah said, like sociocultural environment, how that's shaping all of that. We're talking about student voice, that students are able to dig in and dissect and look at things through their own lens and how to use their voice in ways that are meaningful for them across a variety and dimensions of health and well-being. So again, I think it's also really important, and it's come up a couple times in the conversation, but about being really comprehensive. And so not just zeroing in on one piece of our health and well-being, but recognizing that there are multiple dimensions to our health. And there's our physical health, our social health, our financial health, intellectual, we could go through all of them. But really recognizing that there are so many different ways that we can be quote unquote healthy. And it could look different at different ages, at different stages for different individuals. And really what we're talking about is this idea of well-being. And being healthy and well aren't necessarily interchangeable, right? I can be physically healthy and not feel well. And I can also feel well, and there might be some things going on inside my body, maybe a chronic disease or chronic illness, that by some metrics I might not be considered healthy. So we really, if we're thinking about things in terms of well-being, how do we create systems and through a skills-based approach that really emphasizes the knowledge and skills that young people can learn and integrates functional information. So I'll let Sarah touch on that a little bit, but really this idea of not having to know all the things about everything in order to be healthy and well.
I'm actually surprised Holly's letting me answer that question. She usually loves to talk about functional information, but yeah, and it's funny because actually that's what I was thinking, Holly, when you were talking, is I think one really big thing that's an important message for a lot of health educators, especially because many of us were sort of like taught and raised up and socialized in this space of we have to teach them the knowledge, right? It's very topic focused. That's a traditional way that we all learned health education. And one of the things that always sticks with me is when you look at health behavior theory, knowledge alone does not change behavior. And a lot of times when we're doing trainings, we'll ask people to think about, like, have you done anything in the last 24 to 48 hours that maybe you quote unquote know wasn't the healthiest option? And almost everybody always raises their hands, right? Because that's the reality. There's a million reasons why. Like today, I had a soda, like a full sugar soda. But it's okay. It was fun. It was a one-time thing. I don't do it that often. It's like a treat that I give myself sometimes. But it's not that I didn't know that it maybe wasn't the best choice, but I did it anyway. Analyzing influences, maybe, right? So I think it's just so important to recognize that knowledge alone doesn't change behavior. And so it's really finding that balance of recognizing, Holly used that term, functional information. What is it that students really need to know that is usable, right, and applicable and relevant for them in their context? And I think this circles back really nicely to the conversation that we were just having. Your host country is going to determine functional information, right? Because it could be laws, it could be norms, it could be literal resources, it could be what foods you have available, right? There's so many things that are really contingent to, going back to that conversation of context. And so as health educators, again, I get really excited about this because it's like the skills are kind of similar, right? And whether you use the National Health Education Standards from the US or you have other skills that are really focused within your international school or your school context, it doesn't really quote unquote matter what skills we're talking about. It's just remembering that skill development is the most important piece. And we're using functional information to help them develop those skills. So we might be using the context or the functional information related to substance use to help them develop the skill of decision making. And the way that you teach decision making around substance use might be different depending on what school you're in, right? And what location that you're in. And I just want to put one plug in because I think sometimes, like going back to what Holly said earlier about it being overwhelming, the really great thing, and maybe Amy, you can speak more to this too, about skills-based health education is that when you transition your curriculum to a focus on skill development, you can much more nimbly and flexibly change your curriculum no matter where you are, because the way you develop the skill of decision making doesn't change, but maybe the context that you're doing it does, right? Or the consequences might be different, but you don't actually have to like recreate the wheel every time because your skill focus remains pretty consistent and you can just change it to make it meet the context.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a point too of not just, where we are, but when we are, like in time. So
Yes,
content
yes.
changes constantly. If you would have told me 15 years ago that sexting would have been a thing, and now we're dealing with artificial relationships and AI and deep fakes and all these other things, I couldn't have prepared a unit for that or a
Right.
lesson for that last year even, but I need to address it. And when I ask my students, what topics do you think are important to cover? This last year, it was the most eye-opening thing. You give out the anonymous question box, or now it's a Google form or whatever at the beginning of the sex ed unit. What do you want to talk about? What question do you have? What topic would you like to have covered? And last year I taught 220 10th graders. And HKIS is a pretty international school, so it's a good kind of data set. The question I saw pop up more than anything, and this is the first time I've seen that, is how do I ask someone out? How do I talk to a girl? How do I approach someone that I'm romantically interested in? It came up again and again and again. And so I had to say, okay, this is what they really want to learn about. As one of my students told me when I unpacked it with them, I said, seems like you guys really just want to learn how to start a relationship. This one 10th grader goes, yeah, I want to learn how to use a condom. I'm glad we're going to do that. But I want to learn how to get to the point where that's even an option.
Yeah.
Right now, that seems so distant for me. Oh my gosh, you're right, absolutely. So let's do that. So I had to kind of change one of my units, but because my sex ed unit was anchored in communication, interpersonal communication, I was able to add scenarios that address, getting out of the friend zone, talking to someone, in
Yeah.
addition to like condom negotiation. So the skills can really help you address where we're at this moment in time, and then what the kids want to learn about, things like that. The more time they spend on their screens and the influence of the media on them, the less they know how to talk to each other.
Mhm.
And so that skills-based approach helps us address that as well.
And I think that what I'm seeing happening with young people is that they become deeply, obviously, entrenched in using technology. And many of them are now starting to come back and to recognize that use of technology is sometimes feels problematic, or it doesn't always feel
Mm.
good to do it. It could be easy,
Mhm.
it could be still the quickest way to send a note off to a friend or to make plans, but really looking more for these interactions. And so I think we're starting to circle back to a point, and I think you illustrated beautifully there, Amy, is that students don't know how to do it, and they're recognizing that they don't know how to do it. And we know as they become adults that communication is going to be so important to them in their careers and their jobs and communicating with others. And so being able to stay in tune with where they're at, and then no matter what approach you take, if you're looking at things through an inquiry-based approach or project-based or service learning, that it's less about the approach that you're taking and more about what the outcomes are at the end of the day. And really thinking of health as that verb, right? It's what we do, and the things we do is what's going to either move us closer to or further away from health, and not necessarily being a fixed point in time of either I am healthy or I'm not healthy.
Yeah, and just circling back to that too, it was really interesting seeing the end of course feedback. And I asked the students what lessons they found particularly enjoy or useful or relevant. And one of the students said the communication scenarios. That's when I had them practice asking someone out. And I tried to write the scenarios first, then I had AI help me, then they helped me because they were like, these are not working. But we did those scenarios, and one of the students had written that they found that the most useful because they wouldn't have done it unless they were forced to. But they
Yes.
needed it, and thank you. It's one of those, this is gonna hurt you more than but it's worth it, I promise.
And then the next lesson is, how do you end a relationship?
Yeah.
We were already doing that. That's the funny thing too, he pointed out, we're learning about breakups, but I don't know how to ask someone out.
The full continuum, as you might say.
Yes.
I want to talk more about this AI, tech piece and AI, because that's obviously a huge topic, and we can't not talk about AI. But I just wanted to put a pin on the discussion around skills based curriculum, because obviously we're all coming from a particular context here, and people might say, okay, I'm coming from, say, a different curriculum context, Australian or Canadian or what have you, different kinds of curriculums. How does the skill-based approach map onto those curriculums? How does that intersect with, more of a content-based approach?
Actually, it's interesting because a lot of people don't realize that I'm quite familiar with a lot of different countries' frameworks because I work with so many different international schools. So if you look at the PSHE framework from the UK schools, or you look at the Canadian Ontario curriculum, Australian curriculum, they are skills-based. There's skills in there. There's more content layered in, but you anchor yourself in the skills. And so I often tell people, one of my favorite health colleagues, it's at the Jakarta Intercultural School, Ray Merrigan, and she does a lot of workshops with us, and we'll be presenting at FAYS in November. She's using the Australian curriculum, but she is skills based because she's pulling the skills from those standards and using those to anchor her units and lessons. So find the skills in those and build around it. Also, a lot of our schools are IB and MYP. And so you use the skills in the MYP framework, and then maybe the content from your standards that your host or that your curriculum context is using. And then that helps you be skills informed at the very least.
Yeah, and I think if you ground yourself in what students are doing and really asking the question, not just what is the purpose that they're knowing this for? And if your answer is so they know how to do something else, that's not enough. That it's not just about knowing how to do something. I have to physically develop the ability to do the thing, whether it's make decisions or analyze those influences or evaluate and examine information, determine if it's quality or if it's misinformation or deep information or disinformation, and or to communicate. And if I'm stopping at the point where students are either are knowing or explaining or describing, and we're leaving it at that level, more often than not, you're not very skills based because students aren't actually doing the things that will actually harm their behavior or their health and well-being, which could include their community.
So yeah, on that topic of what students are doing, obviously technology is a huge mediating force in our lives. It's continuously remaking how we have relationships, how students interact. AI is a big topic, and I wonder if we could just sort of go around the horn and talk about a little bit about where you see the impact of AI on health literacy skills, relationships, how students are accessing information. It's changed now, and instead of maybe Googling something and looking at the first results, you're asking ChatGPT or similar. So how is this all coming together, and where do you see it going?
I think there's a lot of beauty in playing around with AI because what we know is that, yes, it can take a lot of information and it can condense it down. And it really boils down to what questions are we asking? And just ask a question where they can find it and AI can tell them. It's not just about whether or not the answers can be found quickly or students can regurgitate something. Again, if I can tell them what the answer is, I'm asking the wrong questions. And so I think what it means in terms of one of the things it means in terms of the health education space is that it's providing students with the ability to navigate it. And again, it's going to be something that's fluid and that's changing, and asking the questions that helps them to internalize, what are you going to do when you find that information? You could get a couple of different responses, but what does that mean for you? And how do you contextualize that? How do you bring that into your decision-making process? Is AI more important than human connection? Right? Asking that question, you found the answer, or you found something online, or asking ChatGPT, but what if that conflicts with your own values and beliefs or the values and beliefs of the people around you? What are you going to do with that? And so really interlayering it is, I think, going to be more effective.
Yeah, and I think this is such like an interesting question, and I know we could spend a lot of time talking about it. I think what it raises for me, and Holly, I think this is what you were saying too, is you still need the skills of accessing valid and reliable information, because you can't count on AI to actually be giving you valid and reliable information all the time, right? So you still need to do that. You need to have an understanding of analyzing influences, because I don't really know a ton about AI, right? But we know a lot about algorithms, right? And how algorithms are going to show you certain kinds of things. And so I think it still kind of comes back in a lot of ways to the skills that we're talking about are even more critical in this like tech AI forward world, right? Because they still need to be able to figure out like how this applies to them. And again, like what's actually valid and reliable and what's not. And I think the other piece that it brings to mind for me is also thinking about like consequences. What are the consequences of all of us using AI? How does that impact the earth? How is that sustainable, right? And like, what are those sort of other impacts that I think sometimes we don't think about when we're just chat GPTing, right? How is this impacting our natural resources, right? And some of these other pieces. So I think to me, it's both an opportunity to think about the importance of skills, because again, I think AI actually just necessitates skill development even more. And then also helping students really think about, as things keep changing and as technology keeps evolving, like how do we sort of, in that broad sense of really zooming out, right? Like, how do humans navigate technology in the context of we're still living on a planet that we have to be thoughtful about? So I think it's really fascinating to remain curious about it too.
Yeah, and I think that just similar to the influence of technology in a lot of our other topic areas, we need to make sure that we're addressing the influence of AI. We used to have like the digital citizenship unit, which we don't really have anymore in health because it's part of every unit, right? We're going to talk about relationships. We're going to talk about the role of texting in a relationship. Now we're also going to talk about the role of AI in relationships or in avoiding relationships. If that many 10th grade boys are struggling with how to talk to a girl, then the ease of talking to an AI chatbot is going to become very appealing. Mm-hmm. And so making sure that we're giving them the opportunities to practice real life skills and communication so that they understand how important that is while still using AI as a useful tool. I mean, when it comes to accessing information, like you said, it can be really useful. For example, when we used to use Google, like type a question a sixth grader might have about puberty into Google and find the good resources that come up. And that question inevitably would be like, how do I get taller fast? You type that into Google, you're going to see a lot of things that are going to try and sell you stuff about how to get taller fast. You type that question into AI, especially if AI knows that you're a 12-year-old boy, and it's going to say, hey, actually, you can't get taller fast. There's no way to do that. Here's some good resources you can learn about how to take care of your health so you can grow to your right ability. So it can help filter that information and kind of cut out the noise. Like anything when it comes to technology, I always try to frame it with the kids as opportunities and challenges. So when it comes to our well-being, what are some of the opportunities we get from AI? That prevents them from shutting down automatically and thinking that I'm just saying, AI is bad, don't use it. And then what are some of the challenges, like you said, on the environment, on our relationships, on how we treat other people? We have stories a lot about deep fakes and things like that coming up. So how do we challenge that? How do we tackle that? And how do our morals come into play in our decision making? So I think that it's really going to layer into a lot of our units and our skills. It's just a question of how do we do that? I'm working on my unit for this year now with all the different stuff that's kind of coming out. But because I'm anchored in the skills, it's not going to be a whole new unit. And that's going to make it a lot easier to address.
That's great. Yeah, I feel like, as you said, Sarah, we could talk forever. This has been a wonderful conversation, but I am also conscious of everyone's time. And so we need to wrap up. But we can't do that before we talk about an opportunity for all of us to get together face to face. And I made a note here to say, Sarah, never apologize for being a curriculum nerd. I feel like all schools, we all need curriculum nerds. It's a very important hat that somebody needs to wear in a school, hopefully more than one person. And we have a great opportunity coming up in phase in November in Singapore for curriculum nerds to unite and also non-curriculum nerds. And we're doing for the first time Health and Wellbeing Summit that Amy, Sarah, and Holly are planning. And so I wondered if Amy, you could talk a little bit about what people could expect at that event, why would they come, and what are you all cooking up for November in Singapore?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I am so excited about this event. Like I said, when I first met Sarah and Holly, it was at a Shape America convention when I was by myself wandering from thing to thing. And in the international context, as health teachers, especially in international schools, we're often a department of one. Mm-hmm. And so we work by ourselves a lot. And, we make connections when we can, and maybe we see each other at conferences. If our school brings in consultants, it's not necessarily related to what we're doing. And so we've been building up our network of health teachers, and I've had more and more of the same people kind of coming to my workshops over the years with Phase. And last year we were able to bring Holly in, and it was so exciting for me to not be able to just lead workshops, but to attend some and have my fellow health teachers from my school and then the other health teachers I work with, schools I'm consulting, and we got to go. And, even just during this conversation, I've taken so many notes. So I learned so much from Holly and Sarah. And so this is now an opportunity for us to have both of them here. And we're all going to be together, and we're going to get everyone together to actually go past that why. There's been a lot of PD about, SEL is important, well-being is important. And us health teachers and well-being people and SEL people are like, yes, we know, we got it. Tell us, how do we do this? And so really getting the chance to dig into some of that unit planning with some of the world's best curriculum nerds in the space of health education. So from that angle, it's going to be a chance really for collaboration. After last year, we created our network of health teachers in the region, and we are active on WhatsApp asking for each other for help and things like that. So that's a big chance as well for networking and continued collaboration, but just the learning around that particular piece. Sarah, Holly, maybe you can add a little bit to that.
No, just really looking forward to the opportunity to, again, to your point, that we started some more conversations last year, and really that this 2-day workshop evolved out of conversations from last year's phase conference. And it was, how do we spend more time together to use the collective wisdom in the room? And that, Sarah and I might be curriculum nerds in that sense. And we love building off of the collective wisdom that is around us, because there's so many good things happening, and that our role many times is to come in and help folks to think through the direction that they want to go, and help them to put those thoughts and ideas onto paper in a way that will also continue to advance student practice and student outcomes. And so we're really looking forward to being there and having this opportunity to work with all the teachers there.
I would just say that I think like our real goal is, like, summarizing what Amy and Holly said, is like building capacity, right? And supporting the strengths that everyone would be bringing, and really thinking about how do we support you in building your capacity to really do effective and sustainable change in your different systems. I mean, and then that's so energizing and exciting, and it's so fun to come together with other folks and just have that vision, right? And then also be able to really drill down and think about, so what are the next steps that are needed? So to me, it just comes to mind of like building capacity, networking, collaboration, building on strengths. Super exciting. It's going to be awesome. Everyone's got to be there.
Yes. And I think about like my language arts colleagues, for example, they can get together with the other 7th grade language arts teacher and create a new unit on a topic that they're interested in or the kids need to learn about. With us, we don't have that opportunity. So getting to go to a place to have the experts there with us and say, we want to build a 7th grade unit on body image that's going to be skills based, and that we get to do it together, and we get to do it together with your input, is just going to be huge. So we're so excited to have you there. And yes, everyone needs to come. It's going to be a great opportunity.
Well, thanks a lot, Amy, and thanks a lot, Sarah and Holly, for the conversation today. Really looking forward to getting together face-to-face in November. It's going to be an amazing opportunity for health teachers to get together. And as you say, not just learn, but also build those connections and collaborations that will really make a difference, I think, in the lives of students in all the schools for the teachers that are attending. Thanks a lot, and look forward to seeing you all in November.